As an editor, I read a lot of books which are fascinating, but some of them make mistakes that I think will make their readers quit before they realize how good the books really are. In this video, I want to talk about how to avoid 9 mistakes that will ensure that readers get to experience the true greatness of your book. The first mistake that makes your book seem less interesting is offering small stakes. When you have small stakes in your story, the reader just doesn't care enough to want to continue reading. And I think a lot of writers get trapped by just offering personal stakes for the character. Let's say there's this guy and they're trying to get a promotion. Okay, those are decent stakes, but they're not high stakes. And what you should do is try to take those personal stakes and expand them out so it affects other people as well. For instance, what if that promotion determines whether he can pay for his wife's medical bills? Okay, now we're getting to some better stakes. Or how about he's trying to close a deal, but if he can't close it, his entire team's going to be laid off. Okay, now the stakes are a lot higher. Another way to approach this is to try the "and what" test. Let's say your protagonist fails. Okay, then what? What happens? If the chain of consequences stops after one "and then that's probably a sign that you have pretty low stakes. For instance, a student failing at a test, that's pretty low stakes. So let's try the "and then" technique. A student fails a test and then they can't get into college. And then they get stuck in a cycle of poverty. And then they can't help their parents out to pay for the rent, or their siblings no longer look up to them. Now you have all this baggage writing on the test, and the stakes are suddenly meaningful. I would like to offer one exception, is that if you're writing in a cozy genre, like a cozy mystery or something, the goal is to have low stakes. So don't try to raise stakes in that situation. The second thing that can make your book look less interesting is starting in the wrong place. A lot of stories that I see simply begin too early. Maybe they're working on world building, or they're trying to set stuff up, or they're going into character backstory. But the trouble is that you lose 50% of your readers before they can even realize how good your book is. So here's an exercise to go to so you can solve this problem. And it's just coming up with a 1-sentence verbal pitch. For instance, a lone astronaut wakes up on a spaceship with no memory of how he got here, and he alone is responsible for trying to save humanity from an extinction level event. Some of you might recognize that as the pitch to Hail Mary by Andy Weir. So in Project Hail Mary, he starts it right at the pitch, right? It's an astronaut waking up, trying to figure out what's going on. Okay, so once you've come up with your 1-sentence pitch, what you want to do is start the very first sentence in the very first paragraph of your book as close as possible to the actual substance of that pitch. And if you want more help writing your book, I would suggest subscribing to my Bookfox Academy, where you can get 10 courses, and I'm currently working on an 11th course about characters that guide you through the whole process of how to write your book, how to do plot, how to do characters, how to write a novel, all of that good stuff. So I'll put the link in the description. You should click on it. Now, a third reason why your book might not seem super interesting to the reader is that you're giving expected emotional reactions. So let's say someone close to your character dies. How do they respond? If you have them respond like crying and they're sad, well, I mean, that's a pretty normal reaction. I think 99.9% of people would react in that way. But you're not really doing any characterization. We don't know anything about this character because they responded in that way. What are some more interesting reactions they could have that are a bit more psychologically complex? For instance, one, what if they seem completely unaffected? They just sort of go stony and cold and don't react in any way. Oh, well, we can see that's the way that they process trauma. What if when someone dies, they make a deeply inappropriate joke? Okay, well, they're trying to use humor to deal with the stress of having someone they love die. That tells us who they are as a person. Or what if when someone dies, your character starts some harmful behavior, like scratching themselves as they sleep? And remember, you can also do the opposite. If something truly happy happens, have your character have an extremely dark or depressed reaction to it. Overall, coming up with unexpected emotional reactions will make sure your book doesn't feel too cliche, doesn't feel too expected, will keep your readers guessing about what's going to happen next and who your character really is. 2 quick examples. In Zero Dark 30 with Jessica Chastain, she finally kills bin Laden, and instead of feeling joy, she feels very conflicted. And a second example is from Room by Emma Donoghue. When Jack finally gets out of captivity and escapes to the real world, we expect him to feel happy, but instead he feels overwhelmed and sad and wants to return to the captivity of the room. This next reason why your book feels uninteresting is probably the most common one I see as an editor. It is number 4, conflict without consequences. When characters face major trauma and they emerge from it completely unscathed, it makes the reader feel as though nothing really matters. Your job as an author is to make sure every single conflict leaves some sort of emotional or physical scars on your character. If your hero fights the villain in chapter 5, by chapter 6, they shouldn't be perfectly fine. They should have some kind of injury that affects them in later scenes. They should have maybe relationships that are warped or changed because of that interaction, or psychological changes like maybe they doubt whether they could actually win against this antagonist. The fifth mistake that makes your book seem uninteresting is ignoring narrative binoculars. So narrative binoculars is just where you sort of scan the horizon of the story and let the reader know like what's coming up next. Now, a lot of authors don't want to do this because they want to keep it a mystery so that when the reader finally gets there, it's like, oh, surprise! But rather than releasing the reader's desire to read onward, telling them what's coming up actually whets their appetite and makes them more excited to see where the story is going to go. And remember, it's still using the technique of mystery because you're not telling the reader everything about what's going to happen in the future. You're just teasing them with little tidbits that make them want to see the details of what's going to happen. Now, this can be as simple as having the ending be in the beginning, like at the beginning of Fight Club with him with all the dynamite beneath the buildings and him with the gun in his mouth. Or it could be starting your story with an older character looking back like, this is what I wished I would have done to save my marriage. So we already know the marriage is going to go south, but we don't know how it happens. Or beginning your book with something like, the first time I stole from my boss, which immediately lets the reader know like, oh, there's going to be multiple times. A sixth mistake that might make your book less interesting is too early solutions. So a lot of authors are absolutely fantastic at coming up with problems for their characters. But what I've seen most often is that they resolve those problems just a little too quickly. Sometimes they resolve it in the next paragraph. Sometimes they resolve it in the next chapter. But almost always, I have to come in and I have to say like, wouldn't it be better if you just waited a little bit longer for that problem to be solved? Because keeping that problem open-ended means the reader's sort of on the hook. The reader's wondering, how is this problem going to be solved? And once you solve that problem, they're like, oh, okay, well, the tension has leaked out of the book now. But I will say there's an exception to this rule, and it's when you're using humor. In The Princess Bride, there's a scene where Wesley is like, if only we had a wheelbarrow. And the characters are immediately like, oh, we have a wheelbarrow. And then he says,
what I wouldn't give for a Holocaust cloak.
What this do?
but in general, the problems that you set up should be resolved a couple chapters later rather than being resolved really quickly. We're going to look at a lot of examples for this next mistake because it is a very important one. It is number 7. Using false suspense. Okay, I am sure that you have a fascinating story. I think sometimes where some authors run into trouble though is they try to artificially make it even more fascinating. And so they use false suspense. And false suspense is basically artificially manufactured drama. Let me give you 3 examples of false suspense. Back when I was in college, I was in this writing workshop and someone turned in a story where the main character was a dog, but the narrator never let you know it was a dog until the very end of the story where it was like, surprise! The narrator's actually a dog. It was terrible. And that's an example of false suspense. I once read another story where the author tried to hide the setting of where the story actually happened until the very end of the story. That also is a kind of false suspense. That's not what you should be keeping secret in your story. A third example, if you start your story with, say, a young girl getting kidnapped by a bunch of men, and then she wakes up and it was all a dream, that's also false suspense. It's something that didn't actually happen. Let me give you 2 quick examples by way of contrast for true suspense and how to do it well. In Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng, this is the first line. Everyone in Shaker Heights was talking about it that summer. How Isabel, the last of the Richardson children, had finally gone around the bend and burned the house down. That is true suspense because we're wondering what made her go around the bend. We're wondering why she burned the house down. We know the details, but we just don't know the why. Another example comes from the spy novelist John le Carre, who wrote The Spy Who Came in from the Cold. Here we have a British spy who apparently defects to East Germany, but all the time we're wondering, was it a real defection or is he becoming a double agent? I think what we learned from this is real suspense is we know the basic facts, but we're wondering, is there a deeper meaning that we don't yet know? That is true suspense. Now, a final point on this before we move on. If your POV character knows something and they deliberately withhold it from the reader, that is an example of false suspense. Every point of view character should be transparent with the reader. What they know should be revealed to the reader. Otherwise, you're manufacturing this false suspense and you're going to make your reader angry. The 8th thing that makes your book seem less interesting than it really is not coming up with a good pitch. Now, the first thing that people see when they see your book is the cover. right? That's the first impression. But the second thing they see is probably not your first line, it's probably the jacket copy. So that means writing a good pitch is probably the most important thing you do for your book. It determines whether people are going to buy your book. It determines whether people are ever going to read your book. It determines whether people are going to finish your book. It determines whether you're going to find the right audience. It determines whether you actually can land a traditional publisher if that's what you're going for. So if you don't know how to write a pitch, look at books being released right now, books that are being released this month or coming out in the next month, and just read a single sentence description of what it's about. You read 100 of those, you're going to get a much better sense of what you have to do to get the reader interested in buying your book and reading your book. You have to create some sort of mystery, you have to create some sort of tension, you have to create some sort of problem and have it happen within a single sentence. Remember that a good pitch helps readers to read your book better. If they have an inkling of what's coming, they're going to be more excited to read your book and be a better reader, a more attentive reader. The last and final thing that you really should watch out for as an author is number 9, over-explaining everything to readers. So over-explaining makes your readers feel really passive when they're reading your book because they're not being active participants sort of figuring stuff out as they go along. It also just destroys like the pleasure that people have when they're like reading a passage and they're like, I know what's gonna happen. Like it wasn't spelled out in the book, but like, I can sense it. That's a really deep pleasure when reading. You don't want to take that away from your readers. I do think in George Orwell's 1984, a lot of the surveillance mechanisms is explained not by like detailing everything that's going on, but just by showing Winston's paranoia about being listened to in situations and watched all the time. We don't have to have the lengthy explanation of how the Big Brother system works. We just sort of see it in action with the character and get a sense for the extensive surveillance system. Another example would be Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. We don't actually need explicit paragraphs to say, you know what? Racism is wrong. No, what we need to do is see, oh, here's this child, she's asking confused questions about why certain people would do things. And so we realize the injustice of racism by the way that she asked those questions. Just remember that if you wrote it correctly, the reader will intuitively get it. You don't need to spell everything out. But let me just give one exception to the rule. If you're doing really complex world building, like say in sci-fi or fantasy or something, there are times when you do need to explicitly spell out the mechanisms of this new world so the reader can understand it and go on the journey with the character. That's not a terrible thing. It's okay if you need to do that. I hope that helps you. Make sure that your book is as interesting as possible to your readers, and don't forget to check out Bookfox Academy. The link is in the description.